Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Evan Medeiros. I'm the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. It's my pleasure to welcome you to yet one more in our series of talks where we bring in scholars, practitioners, and experts on different dimensions of the Indo-Pacific. Today, I'm very, very excited to introduce a friend and colleague, Peter Martin, to talk about his new book. Peter, who I believe I met in Beijing, or was it London, Peter? I don't remember. But anyway, he currently resides in Washington, and he's the defense policy and intelligence reporter for Bloomberg. But more importantly, he is the author of a wonderful new book. Peter and I talked about it during the drafting stage repeatedly. And his new book is called China's Civilian Army, the Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. And I can't think of a book that is both more interesting and better timed than this. Peter has an extensive background on China issues. He was previously based in Beijing, where he wrote extensively about Chinese foreign policy and the US-China relationship. Peter, I recall, actually did some very interesting, unique reporting where he traveled up to the China-North Korea border. He even went out to Xinjiang multiple times. So he's one of those sort of high-risk, intrepid reporters that always writes interesting stuff. So when he came to me with this idea he had about sort of writing about the evolution of China's more aggressive public diplomacy, I thought that was an important topic, and he was exactly, the right guy to write this book. What we've asked Peter to do is to use about 20 to 25 minutes to briefly sketch out the core arguments in the book. And, Peter, anecdotes are always great. So if you could sort of, sprinkle some of that color across what is an otherwise exceptionally well-argued book, that would be great. And then after Peter's done, we're going to open it up for Q&A. In terms of Q&A, the best thing to do is, like we do in class, use the raise hand function. And that way, we just let Zoom, determine who raised their hand first. Or you can drop questions in the chat if issues come up as Peter is talking. So with that, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure for us to have you here. We're very excited to give you a venue to talk about this great book. And so over to you, Peter.
Thanks so much. This is a real pleasure. My partner actually graduated from Georgetown, so I feel like I get some brownie points at home for talking here. And so did Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He didn't get a degree, but he studied there, so it's a double whammy. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then kind of sketch out some of the key arguments. And as Evan knows, I arrived back in Beijing in early 2017 after being away for a few years, and Xi Jinping was rolling out the Belt and Road Initiative. China's economy was beating estimates. Xi was on the cusp of announcing China's first overseas military base in Djibouti. And, even more importantly, Donald Trump was busy picking fights with US allies and criticizing multilateral institutions. And there seemed to be this just incredible opening for China to step up and take on a leadership role. And while, Xi Jinping did work hard toward that end with his fancy speech at Davos in January that year, in general, Chinese diplomacy, Chinese public diplomacy kind of fell short of stepping into that void. And so I became really interested in why that was the case, and what it was about China and its political system that seemed to hold it back. And I was working as a journalist, of course, and so I was going to these daily foreign ministry press briefings, which are kind of a bewildering combination of being very repetitive and dull, but also slightly hostile. And I
So
started to
repetitive,
realize,
dull, and hostile, Peter.
yeah,
That's a winning
it's
combination.
quite, I know.
That's right. Really
And,
makes you want to be an MFA reporter, doesn't it?
right. And, and also I spent a lot of time talking with people like you, Evan, who'd sat for many hours across the table from Chinese negotiators, and you very quickly realized that, like Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who studied at Georgetown, China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi, who studied at the London School of Economics and at Bath, these are sophisticated people. They know the countries where they have served overseas very well. They are, many of them, exceptionally talented with foreign languages. They can crack jokes. They can be funny. They, Yang Jiechi in particular is kind of good at picking out items from the New York Times culture section and using them, and to create small talk. And yeah, when they get up on stage in the foreign ministry at those press conferences, or they sit down across the table from foreign interlocutors, the behavior turns into this sort of quite stilted performance where they stick rigidly to talking points, even if those talking points aren't resonating with others. They can be quite ideological at times, and when they feel threatened or cornered, they can also be quite aggressive and abrasive. And of course, over the last few years, we've seen an increasing amount of that kind of aggressive, assertive, abrasive behavior. So I started to see Chinese diplomats as kind of a microcosm of that broader struggle that China had to communicate. And, one of my biases, I guess, in China studies is that I think anytime you turn to original Chinese language sources, you're looking at a body of material which is massively underutilized and probably can yield a great deal. So kind of with that mindset, I started looking for, okay, how can I use open source material to look at the foreign ministry in addition to, kind of my daily reporting and interviews, and realized that there was this body of diplomats' memoirs, some of which had kind of been used in historical accounts of things like the outbreak of the Korean War, or those kind of like historical events that hadn't really been looked at in very much detail, to kind of examine the inner world of Chinese diplomats and Chinese diplomacy. So I started to use them, and at the time, frankly, it was a pretty niche topic. I didn't really care because it interested me and I wanted to pursue it. But from 2017 onwards, Chinese diplomats engaged in these public displays where they would walk out of international meetings, they would shout at foreign counterparts. During the coronavirus, they spread conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus, insulted foreign leaders on Twitter. And you had this phrase, wolf warrior diplomacy, which became really prominent. But one of the things I learned researching the book was that actually the roots of this kind of behavior go back an incredibly long way and long predate this phrase, wolf warrior diplomacy, which we all know now. And really, they were visible right from the very first days of the People's Republic after the revolution. When Mao Zedong founded a new China in 1949, the country basically had no diplomats to speak of. There was a small group of very talented foreign affairs officials who had worked closely with Zhou Enlai in the Yan'an years before the communists' victory. And they had a bunch of students, kind of former peasant revolutionaries and former soldiers, to build the foreign ministry. They believed that anyone else who had been left behind by the nationalists was too ideologically impure to represent China on the world stage. And they faced this kind of paradoxical challenge where, on the one hand, this was an underground political movement which had spent years running away from enemies inside China and surviving by the skin of its teeth, and was deeply paranoid about outside influences, and deeply aware of the fragility of the revolution that they had just been through, facing a new superpower, the United States, which was hostile to communist governments everywhere, and a rival regime on Taiwan, which hoped to take their place. But they also had this, they were isolated, and they needed to build out ties with the outside world in order to legitimize their own rule, and stabilize that situation. So faced with that paradoxical challenge, China's first foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, came up with this idea that the Chinese diplomatic corps should be modeled on the People's Liberation Army. He said it should act like the PLA in civilian clothing. And what he meant by that was that Chinese diplomats would be unfailingly loyal to the Communist Party, just like the PLA. They would be disciplined to a fault, and they would crucially display what he called a fighting spirit when China's interests were challenged. And so with that kind of martial militaristic ethos came a set of behaviors which were established early on and have continued through till today. So I talked about sticking closely to talking points. Chinese diplomats move around in pairs to keep tabs on each other. They will sometimes shout at foreign counterparts in very calculated and controlled displays of sort of performative anger if they feel challenged, and oftentimes they'll elevate even the smallest slights into major international incidents, and that kind of approach led to displays that we would now label wolf warrior diplomacy right from the outset. So in 1950, this veteran revolutionary Wu Xiuquan, guy had a bullet scar across his cheek, very little experience as a diplomat. He led a delegation to the United Nations in New York, and he delivered this speech which honestly kind of makes today's wolf warriors look like a bunch of wimps. Time magazine described it as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation. And in the subsequent decade, in the 1960s, Chinese diplomats were so combative that they engaged in literal fistfights with foreigners, and one of them was pictured wielding an axe outside the Chinese representative office in London. But together with those kind of wolf warrior tactics, there was this other tradition in Chinese diplomacy, which was characterized by an instinct to charm the world and to win friends, and aim to persuade others of China's good intentions rather than just telling the world off and instructing the world to accept China on its own terms. And that kind of charm instinct manifested itself with great success in the mid-1950s when Zhou Enlai visited the Bantong conference and was able to make major inroads into the developing world. And it manifested itself again in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre in the 1990s, when China was able to set aside territorial disputes to leverage its domestic program of economic reform. And a topic which Evan has done a great deal of work on, was also able to engage in diplomacy around nuclear non-proliferation and to win friends using those kind of approaches. So these two tendencies, I think, have kind of ebbed and flowed over time and cycled in and out of fashion. And starting really around 2008, we saw quite a definitive lurch toward the assertive tendency. And I think that came from kind of 2 places. On the one hand, there was a new confidence which Chinese leaders had about their place in the world. And on the other hand, there were these enduring insecurities which really have been with China from the very outset. And so that new confidence came, I think, from successfully navigating the financial crisis and watching the kind of slower and more timid response that policymakers in the West, in the US, but especially in Europe, had to those events, and starting to believe that maybe there was something to China's system, and there was an alternate model here which they might be able to demonstrate to others, and they could feel confident And of course, those feelings have only compounded as they've watched political gridlock across the West, unsuccessful wars in the Middle East, sluggish growth in Europe, and recently, of course, the events around the coronavirus pandemic. So there's that kind of new confidence, but at the same time, those same insecurities which have plagued Chinese diplomats from 49 are still there. And under Xi Jinping, since 2012, they've been compounded. So as you know, Xi Jinping launched a sweeping anti-corruption campaign, which has punished more than 1.5 million officials. He has experimented with re-education camps in far Western China. He's clamped down on Hong Kong, abolished presidential term limits, focused on ideology and warned of foreign threats to China. And all of these things, I think, if you're a Chinese diplomat, you're able to kind of spot those signals and figure out the safest way for you to respond, which is usually just to follow the lead that China's paramount leader has set out. And in Xi's case, that involves a much more bold approach to international affairs. Xi Jinping has talked about China moving ever closer to the center of the world stage, standing tall in the East, never tolerating being bullied by foreign powers. And if you're an ambitious Chinese diplomat, you're going to listen to those messages, you're going to match them. And if you are looking for a promotion, maybe you'll even go a little bit further. So I think that kind of combination of confidence, but also real insecurity on a kind of personal level, I think goes a long way to explaining the rise of what we now call wolf warrior diplomacy. And it was something that really went into high gear after the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, where again, you had Chinese officials feeling pretty good about the way that they had contained the pandemic after its initial outbreak. And, of course, as they watched Europe and the United States struggle to do the same, but they also felt cornered and criticized on all fronts by foreign countries and felt the need to respond to that with outbursts which, made waves across the world. And if there's one figure who's really come to symbolize that approach, it's current Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian, who was a relatively obscure figure in China's embassy in Islamabad and built up.
And in Washington, Peter.
In Washington.
Yeah, he was yes, I remember going to many meetings with the Chinese ambassador when I was at the NSC, and Zhao Lijian was there. He was one of the many folks in the audience, or sort of that the ambassador brought with him. He was pretty quiet. He sort of was would help arrange meetings and such. So yeah.
I think that's one of the great the things that's easy to miss about Zhao when you just read his Twitter account. On Twitter, he has this outsized big personality. And in person,
never would have guessed that.
Right.
Not even
he kind
remotely.
Of stammers over his words, mumbles a little bit. He's one of those people who is kind of big online and pretty quiet in person. But anyway, so he kind of rocketed to fame, particularly after picking this Twitter fight with former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, Evans' old boss. And
never a good thing to do, by the way, either in person or over Twitter.
I'll take your word for it. But that kind of shot him to fame inside the foreign ministry, and he ended up being appointed spokesman. Not something that, if you had looked at his resume, you would have guessed was a natural fit for him. But I think we can fairly surmise was a reward for this new tone that he took on social media. And I think other diplomats around the world kind of spotted that incentive structure, the fact that this behavior was being rewarded, and worked to emulate it. And that led to a kind of proliferation of this behavior across the world. Gui Tongyo, who just left as China's ambassador in Sweden, was summoned to Sweden's foreign ministry 40 times in the space of 2 years. And when he was asked to explain his combative behavior, he said in an interview that for our friends, we have fine wine, and for our enemies, we have shotguns, which gives you some idea of his general approach to
and that's
diplomacy.
to Sweden. I can tell you, as somebody that has worked with diplomats all over the world, like, if you're going after the Swedes and angering the Swedes, that's sort of a unique skill, given how friendly and open and sophisticated and engaging they are, right?
Right.
If you're picking a fight with Sweden, that takes a particular mindset.
And you know, not everyone in the foreign ministry was comfortable with this new tone, and I think many people still are pretty uncomfortable with it, although they don't feel tremendously empowered to speak out about that. Yuan Nansheng, who was China's former consul general in San Francisco, warned about a trend toward extreme nationalism in Chinese foreign policy. And even Xi Jinping, in a Politburo study session earlier this year, talked about the need, it's kind of acknowledged the backlash that's arisen against China, and talked about the need for the country to cultivate a lovable image, while at the same time also talking about discourse struggle and many of the other themes that he has pursued and have helped to create this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy. But you know, as I say, this kind of combative stance has been there right from the beginning. And I guess maybe we can enter into Q&A now, because I'm curious to hear Evan's thoughts and to field questions from anyone who's interested.
Well, Peter, thank you. That was great. And it was a wonderful summary of the broad arc of your book. Let me throw out a couple questions that sort of come to mind. The first is sort of in this basket of causality, right? What caused this? Because as you said, there was this instinct among Chinese diplomats, right? Patterns of sort of being very aggressive before, you know, being more Mao than Mao, as the Chinese used to say. So I guess my question is, in terms of understanding the causes of it, number one, how much of it do you attribute to insecurity versus ambition, right? Is wolf warrior diplomacy, what I mean by that is the behavior we're witnessing today, not its previous manifestation today. Is it sort of insecurity about the world blaming it for COVID, American pressure, you know, Trump's aggressive policies, or is it ambition? Now is time. Now is our time. Nobody should be questioning us. Second, how much of it is sort of internal versus external, right? How much of wolf warrior diplomacy is speaking to Beijing, you know, making sure Zhao Lijian wanting to show his people and the Chinese people that the MFA really is protecting their interests, and how much of it is external, prompted by, you know, aggressive diplomacy on others. You know, responding to the argument was made, you know, because the Trump administration in their last year was, you know, talked about dividing the Communist Party from the Chinese people, you know, raising the prospect of destabilizing China. Did that have a role to play? So maybe you could talk a little bit about the causality dimension of this, Peter.
Yeah. So I guess I think of the insecurities and the ambitions as kind of intricately linked. I would guess that the leading practitioners, people like Zhao, Gui Tongyo, Lu Xiaoye, who was China's ambassador in Canada and then France, I think that the way that they talk about China's role in the world is probably pretty sincere and deeply felt. And they previously were not working in a system that allowed them to express those views or rewarded them for doing so. And what happened was that they started matching this tone that Xi Jinping, you know, because I think like Xi's tone kind of got out ahead of the foreign ministry in some cases. And there was this early on in his tenure, I've spoken to former US officials who met with their one-time MFA counterparts and just talked about how kind of bewildered they were in the early Xi Jinping years, and they were really struggling to figure out what their tone should be, because in the
Can
past,
you give us an example? What were some of the early Xi statements that people found to be remarkable?
Right off the bat, even before Xi became president, there was this widely publicized speech that he gave to a group of Chinese business people, but also Chinese diplomats in Mexico.
Right. But have you seen a copy of that speech? I tried to find one and never had any luck. Did you?
There's a recording of part of it. There's a video of part of it. I haven't seen a copy of the whole speech, but I've seen the video clip.
Right.
And there was in WikiLeaks, there is a cable from, I think, the US ambassador, or maybe it's the poll section chief in Mexico, who wrote back to Washington which has like quotes from the speech.
Oh, interesting.
And he talks about how surprised he was at the tone that she took. I talked to a bunch of Chinese diplomats who were posted in different embassies across the world, and it turns out that was actually kind of a set piece that she repeated multiple times. He said it in Europe and other places. This where he talked about foreigners with full bellies who have nothing better to do but to point the finger at China, and so there was this sense that he saw China's role in the world differently and than his predecessors, and that he was not going to tolerate criticism of China or show any deference to foreign leaders who wanted to offer lessons on the political direction or the economic direction that China might follow. He, of course, in the very early weeks of him being appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, made a visit to a museum in Beijing where he talked about the Chinese dream, which he defined as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is a theme that Chinese leaders have come back to for more than a century, even before the CCP came to power. But it's something that Xi made front and center of the way that he defined his tenure, in a way that I think previous leaders had focused a little bit more on development and economic growth. For Xi, that was kind of subsumed into this kind of nationalist dream. And since then, the statements have gotten stronger and stronger. He talked to Jim Mattis, about a former Secretary of Defense, about never giving up an inch of territory. And he's given speeches on Taiwan. He gave speeches on the May 4th movement anniversary, where he really kind of embraced this nationalist tone. And Chinese diplomats, I think, weren't quite sure how to keep up with that, but Zhao showed one possibility. And I think since then, the foreign ministry has kind of moved in that direction. I think one figure who is a really sort of telling case study on this is Hua Chunying, who is the head of the information section. Hua, I understand, is pretty sincere in her kind of nationalist views, and she had things that she wanted to say when Lu Kang was head of the information section, but felt unable to express them. And when I started covering her in 2017, her press conferences were the least likely to make news out of any of the speakers. She was extremely cautious and kind of deliberately bland in the way that she expressed herself. But she's kind of gone on this transformation where now when she speaks in public, I mean, she sounds like the opinion page of the Global Times. It's really remarkable. And so I think she's an example of a figure where, like, she had something to say and it sounded kind of wolf warrior-ish, but her superiors didn't allow that to happen. And now, that's
safety's off now. Is what
exactly,
you're saying.
exactly.
Interesting.
Anyway, sorry, we got bogged down on that. I do think that the Trump administration played a role as well, and I think that Secretary of State Pompeo was a particularly intense irritant for the foreign ministry. The reason for that is, Trump could talk about like halting China's economic growth, or could be rude about Chinese industrial policies, or even you could talk about China's foreign policies and all of these things, and those things upset Chinese officials. But Pompeo went to a different place where he questioned the legitimacy of the Communist Party's rule over China, which is is the reddest of red lines. And I think that foreign ministry officials saw that as kind of a test of their willingness to stand up for Xi and to defend the system. And the way that they spoke about him was just extraordinary. I've never seen them do it to another official. Incredibly personal, vicious attacks on Pompeo, which of course he matched and even exceeded in his own remarks about China. But I do think that we wouldn't have seen like that kind of rhetoric if they didn't feel like he was kind of rubbing salt into their wounds.
Interesting. Well, that's great. Well, let's see. We've got a variety of questions queuing up. I've got James Court and Philip Rogers. James and Philip, yeah, when you ask your question, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera, that would be fantastic. And for both of you, first, let's get James. Just introduce yourself and tell us about what you do here at Georgetown. So James, you first.
Yes, hi, my name is James Court. I'm an SSP student, first year in the Georgetown program. My question is, given the wolf warrior tendencies, or maybe even at this point a full-on policy of wolf warrior behavior, how do you think diplomatic indications of that would occur prior to a conflict with China, for example, over Taiwan or South China Sea, or take your pick of environment, how do you think those will change given the new wolf warrior, a little more combative to begin with? How do you think diplomatic cues for force will change?
It's a great question. The Taiwan rhetoric was like at a 9 out of 10 even before the wolf warrior stuff started, right? Any provocation from the US is met with this stock phrase: America is playing with fire on the Taiwan question, which is pretty dramatic to start with. I don't know that in truth the foreign ministry would be the best barometer for whether a conflict was going to break out. I'm not really convinced that they would be in the decision-making loop for that. If I were trying to judge it, I would probably look much more closely at A, Xi Jinping's speeches and remarks, B, the remarks of anyone remotely authoritative in the People's Liberation Army and PLA media, and then of course at satellite imagery of Chinese troop movements. I doubt that the foreign ministry would have much more than just a kind of reactive mopping up the damage type role in a scenario like that. Be curious to hear what Evan thinks.
I think historically speaking, so if the past is any indication, the Chinese have actually a fairly deliberate hierarchy of signaling that they use, from the deputy MFA spokesman sort of all the way up to statements by the party. But I agree with Peter that it's become a little bit more complicated now that the Ministry of Defense, or the notional Ministry of Defense is in the game of communications. And I believe, is it weekly or bi-weekly that there's a Ministry of Defense press conference, Peter, in Beijing? I forget.
It's monthly. And
it's not even bi-weekly, right?
It's excruciating.
Right. Yeah. So I agree with Peter that I think what it does ultimately, James, is it makes it for I would say, the sort of conventional watcher of China, it makes it more difficult to discern signals, because you really have to be sort of trained in the arcane art of MFA statements on Taiwan to understand sort of what's background noise or what's signal and what's noise. That's a better way to put it, right? And we're in one of those environments now where there's lots of noise, not a lot of signals, right? And then when you look at behavior, the fact that there were some 150, combat aircraft flown over Taiwan over the last, 5 days or so, or I should say starting last weekend, it becomes worrisome. So communication becomes more difficult, right? So I think the simple answer is, given what Peter has documented, the signal to noise ratio gets much more difficult to discern. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be careful and judicious in interpreting Chinese signals. And, Taiwan is a sort of special case, and it makes it even harder, but it can be done. And the Chinese remain, fairly deliberate on the Taiwan piece, of course, until they're not, So there you go.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Philip, over to you.
Great, thank you. So my name is Philip Rogers. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow at the Mortara Center's Global Political Economy Project. So my question is about blind spots, because one of the compelling things I think that you were talking about with regards to the history of all this is it's not necessarily fully new. There are certainly antecedents that date all the way back to the founding of the PRC and such. So when we think about what's happening in China now, a lot of people are saying, well, Xi Jinping is like in many ways sort of a second coming of Mao. He's reverting back to some of this Maoist type governance that we haven't seen in a while. So this wolf warrior diplomacy kind of could get lumped into just that basket, that is just another redo of Mao. So on the one hand, I don't think it's necessarily an either or. It can definitely be a both and in terms of how new this is and how this tracks with history. But what blind spots are we creating for ourselves if we, in our analysis, if we simply say, well, this is just fully consistent with Xi Jinping's turn back towards more Mao-style governance on the one hand, and then what blind spots do we create for ourselves if we say, well, this is kind of a new thing, a brave new world, a post-financial crisis world, and this is a new sort of wolf warrior diplomacy. It's got a catchy name and that sort of a thing that has emerged.
Yeah. So the Mao question is interesting. I agree with much of what you said, but I'm going to slightly take issue with the idea that really anything much in the Xi Jinping project is a return to Maoism. I think he is very interested in orthodox Communist Party opinion, but I'm not sure it's Maoism, and in some ways,
right, and that's why I emphasize the blind spots, because I think a lot of people lump it in with just pure Maoism.
Yeah, I mean, so in some ways, I think that Mao was never a huge fan of the foreign ministry. I think partly because he saw it as a kind of a useful tool, but partly because Zhou Enlai ran it with such structure and attention to hierarchy that those were the kinds of structures that Mao wanted to kind of rip down and turn on their heads. And Xi Jinping actually does like those types of really hierarchical structures, and has, the whole of his governance project is about introducing party control over state, civil society, business, etc., and then making sure that the writ of the party center runs all the way down those structures, and that his word also is able to direct the will of the party center. And in some ways, I see wolf warrior diplomacy as a response to that. She wants a more combative, assertive tone, and the foreign ministry, with its great discipline, responds and follows that. In other ways, and especially the wolf warrior behavior on Twitter is really, in my mind, almost sort of antithetical to the Xi project. He wants control and hierarchy and Chinese diplomats, in some cases, are sort of freelancing policy on social media without getting prior permission. And so I've long been puzzled by why that's allowed to continue, and whether he will start to kind of mop things up. And just explain to me again the blind spots part of the question.
Well, so I think it's tempting to look at this as just a natural part of Xi Jinping being, you know, the new strongman hierarchical, and some people will, as you point out, erroneously link that to just this sort of return to Mao style governments. So in other words, we're just linking this with just general Xi Jinpingness and not necessarily seeing it on its own face and maybe missing something. And then on the flip side, because there are some of these historical antecedents that you've talked about, if we just say, well, this is something completely Brave New World, what might we be missing with that viewpoint into it? If we can sort of do not necessarily an either or, but a both and sort of analysis, I think it would probably be fruitful. But what do you think are the pitfalls of sort of being overly simplistic about lumping it in one of these sort of two major categories?
Yeah, I don't think we want to do either of those things. Like, I kind of think of it as not history repeating itself, but it's present day events rhyming with history. And we can use history to kind of inform our assumptions about the incentive structures that allow this to happen. And, you know, wolf warrior diplomacy is something that follows Xi, but it's also something that stems from the intellectual and political climate in China that made Xi Jinping and the Xi Jinping project possible. You know, I sort of emphasized in my remarks, this is something that started in 2008 and predates Xi, this kind of turn towards assertive diplomacy, and that stems from widespread perceptions among China's political elite of Western decline, and this idea that China has a model which deserves to be respected and maybe emulated, and also widespread fears about, you know, after 2011, the Arab Spring, about the place that autocratic regimes would be able to play in the world unless they reformed and clamped down on influences that might undermine them. And so, you know, wolf warrior diplomacy comes from Xi. It comes from the environment that made Xi possible. And so I think you're quite right. Like, we wouldn't want to fall either into pretending that it's just a return to the 1950s, but we do well if we acknowledge how these kind of incentives have remained quite consistent over time and try to be informed by past precedent.
谢谢。
We've got 3 questions now. Julia Wong, Carson, and Jake. So Julio, if you wouldn't mind maybe turning your camera on just so we can see you, and great. And please just, you know, tell us who you are, what you do here at Georgetown, and your question for Peter.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Julio. I'm from China, and I'm a freshman in the SFS. And so I want to return explicitly to the question that was raised earlier about whether this, like, Chinese diplomacy, the message is sending is external or internal. So it's like it's directed to the West, or it is directly towards, like, inside China. Because based on my observation in China, we receive our like wolf warrior diplomatic message every day on our phone every day, and our news program always starts with the remarks of Zhao Lijian on the press conference, like daily press conference. And Peter, you mentioned that the diplomats follow the, like, tone set by President Xi Jinping, like trying to advance on their diplomatic course, like on their job, by following the tone set by Xi and Zhao. And then if China really wants to like create a friendly image in the world and make friends with, like, Western countries, it should not be, like, talking about very, like, hardline policies, or, like, do not having like do not get any possibility for Western countries to criticize or make comments on the Chinese policies and its system. So to me, it seems more like an internal message. I would like to hear your thinking about that, because this question, I don't think it is addressed like very clearly. So I just want to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a great question, and I completely agree with your observations. Of course, all diplomats across the world need to think about multiple different audiences as they deliver their remarks. Some of those are internal and sometimes they're external. I think that, so there's kind of a spectrum. I think on that spectrum, Chinese diplomats need to worry about domestic opinion more than most of their foreign counterparts. And when they think about domestic opinion, there are sort of multiple levels there that they need to think of as well. One is the tone that Xi Jinping has set and his expectations for the Chinese government and for Chinese foreign policy. Another is kind of the broader CCP political elite. Then they have their bosses in the foreign ministry, and really importantly as well, they have the Chinese public. And you wouldn't necessarily think that would be such a big deal in a system that's not democratic and where these people don't vote and those kind of things, but actually it is really important, and kind of because the foreign ministry and foreign ministry spokesmen and spokespeople in particular have an outsized role representing China to the world. There are, when you think of the United States, there are so many different voices that represent the US on the world stage. Some of those are inside the US government and some of them aren't. But, President Biden speaks to the media directly nearly every day. So does his, the White House spokesperson. Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, is just one voice among many. But on a lot of issues, the foreign ministry kind of is the voice of China, because top leaders, including Xi, speak in these kind of platitudinous remarks, which are quite hard to interpret on the specifics, and they do so relatively infrequently. And I agree with you that the wolf warrior tactics have been pretty counterproductive, and I think that there are many people inside the foreign ministry who are fully aware of that. They've seen Pew polling, which suggests that China's foreign policy, one part of that is wolf warrior diplomacy, has caused damage. They see their foreign counterparts complain about it. In the US, they will have watched the Senate confirmation hearings earlier this year, where officials ranging from the Department of Defense to CIA and, of course, the State Department talked about wolf warrior diplomacy and the concerns that's caused. I just think that the domestic consideration that this is a tone that Xi Jinping wants, this is something that's going to keep me safe professionally and perhaps also advance my career, trumps those concerns. So I guess in answer, it's a mixture, but I see it as kind of domestic first.
So if it is domestic first, then like how do Chinese diplomats really establish a favorable image and communicate in a sincere way with their Western counterparts?
I think it's exceptionally hard for them to do so. And in some cases, it's easier just to engage in posturing. President Biden, in his recent call with Xi Jinping, talked about how his frustrations at how interactions with Chinese counterparts have become unproductive. And I think that reflects quite a widespread feeling, right? How do you have a conversation with these people if they're just going to recite the same talking points you've heard again and again?
So, Peter, what you're saying essentially is that wolf warrior diplomacy, or this kind of aggressive public diplomacy, has been quite harmful for China's external image. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think I wouldn't want to exaggerate the role that wolf warrior diplomacy on its own has played there. It's come as part of a package. Chinese industrial policies have upset multinational companies.
Yeah.
China's military maneuvers have upset the Pentagon and many people in Congress.
Sanctions on countries like Australia.
Right. Human rights abuses. All of these kind of things have kind of had a cumulative effect. But what I think wolf warrior diplomacy did was to sharpen the perceptions that China was a threat and to kind of put a human face on it. Because for a long time, from if you think of that like 2008 to I don't know 2014 type period, there was this really quite assertive Chinese foreign and defense policy matched with this just kind of quite bland and safe tone from the foreign ministry, or relative to now anyway.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like China's actions and its words didn't really match up. I think what the Wolf Warriors did was just meld those two things together in a way that really kind of crystallized the threat. Interesting.
Great. Well, we've let's see, we still have time. We got about 30 minutes left. We've got a variety of questions. I'm going to just again use the Zoom queue. I'm going to start with Carson Elmgren, then go to Jake Lensing Sharp, and then Martin Gallardo. So Carson, please, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Carson. I'm a second year SSB student at Georgetown and happen to be one of Professor Medeiros' students currently. Thanks for coming to chat with us. I have kind of a two-part question. The first of which you may have mentioned, but I may have just missed it, is if you have observed any kind of change in tone since she made the statement about, how China needs to cultivate a trustworthy and lovable and whatever else it was image abroad. And then also, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the new Chinese ambassador to the US, Qin Gang, who it seems to me is kind of continuing the tradition of Cui Jiankai as being a pretty, measured, non-wolf warrior style of interaction, and which seems kind of as expected, I guess, in my view. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that also. Thanks.
Yeah, great questions. So it's hard to judge whether Xi Jinping's remarks in that speech made very much difference. My impression is that there hasn't been very much softening of tone, and I think in the week following that speech about a lovable image, a Chinese consul general tweeted an image of an outstretched middle finger, saying that this is how China treats its critics. So like he certainly didn't get the memo.
Hold on, Peter. Outstretched middle finger? You mean just a raised middle finger? You don't mean like elongated?
A big middle. He gave the finger to the world and said that was how China was.
Got it. Just wanted to make sure all of us had the mental image of what was.
Wanted to avoid gesticulating to such an august.
Thank you. Yes, audience. University audiences, we prefer. Yeah, the physical description is fine.
Right. So I haven't seen very much change to the tone. The recent meeting between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi seems to have been absent some of that public posturing, partly because the meeting wasn't set up in a format that would allow Yang to give a big public diatribe like he did in Anchorage, and partly I think because both sides have been have made a concerted effort to kind of return to dialogue a little bit. So maybe that's some softening, but I think that probably flows more from like Xi Jinping's instructions on US-China relations than from like the speech in particular. And I in truth, I don't know that I would even just based on the speech itself that I would expect much softening. I think that she talked about the need to tell China's story better, and to kind of improve the messaging around what China does a little bit, but he didn't really offer any indication that he wants to change the policies that have led to the backlash around the world, or even that he wanted the tone softened in any major way. So we'll see, but I haven't seen much change. I know there's a project going on at University College Dublin where they are taking a look at tweets before and after Xi's speech to see if they can like quantify any change in the language. So it'll be really interesting to see when the results of that come out. But just kind of anecdotally, I can't see very much difference. Qingang, I think what's really important to remember about, or at least the way I think of the wolf warrior is, I think wolf warrior diplomacy is a tactic. I don't really think of it as like a cohesive group of individuals who are wedded to that approach. Every single successful Chinese diplomat is capable of doing things that we would describe as wolf warrior diplomacy at some times. If you read accounts of Kurt Campbell's negotiations with Cui Tiankai over the release of blind activist Chen Guangcheng, while Cui is suave and kind of fits in that charm offensive meld most of the time, he is capable of going red in the face and shouting at people when he needs to. And I don't think he does it because he loses his temper. He does it because it's a tactic he wants to resort to at that time. So I say that because I think that's also true of Qingang. I think he can be suave and sophisticated and fits into that charm offensive meld. And I've spoken to European diplomats who dealt with him while he was vice minister in Beijing, and he can really go full wolf warrior when he needs to. He hasn't done that very much in public, but in private, I understand he's pretty capable of using those tactics. I think the way that he has behaved in the US so far reflects the realities of Chinese diplomacy with America, which is, if you listen to people in Washington, you would think that most wolf warrior diplomacy was aimed at the US most of the time, and it's just not true. Chinese diplomats are much more restrained in the way that they speak to their US counterparts because the US has the largest economy in the world and the world's most powerful military. When they talk to Swedish diplomats or French or British or Canadian or Australian diplomats, they really kind of let loose a little bit more. And so I think that Qin's behavior reflects what Xi Jinping wants from an envoy in Washington, which is to kind of build bridges and strengthen ties.
Great.
That makes sense. Thanks.
All right, let's go over to Jake Lensing Sharp. Jake?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, Peter. My name is Jake. I'm a second year in Georgetown's MSFS program. I'm also taking a class with Professor Medeiros, just like the last speaker or last question. But my question for you is, there's this big kind of centralizing concept of China's economic diplomacy right now under win-win or Shuangyin cooperation. And I was wondering how you see wolf warrior diplomacy coming into conflict with China's efforts to make more win-win cooperation, particularly in respect to China's relationships with other developing countries, because you just mentioned there are plenty of examples with Sweden and France and Australia, these Western developed countries. But I'm just curious how you see wolf warrior diplomacy affecting China's relationship with other poorer countries.
Yeah, I think the picture is like more mixed when it comes to the developing world. There are, and so that there's kind of a spectrum, right? Like Chinese diplomats in Africa, as far as I can tell, have behaved in a pretty restrained way, which focuses on cooperation. And when there have been cases of like wolf warrior statements, they've not been aimed at African leaders; they've been aimed at Donald Trump. But then there are other places, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Venezuela, Brazil, where wolf warrior tactics have been aimed at local elites. When there's in Venezuela, it was about criticism over the virus. In Brazil, it was the same thing. In Fiji, it was about the status of Taiwan, and in Papua New Guinea, it was about negotiations over a communique which involved the US. So in those places, it's been when kind of hot button issues have been raised that they've resorted to wolf warrior tactics. There are other places in the developing world where the tone has just been like aggressive and unwilling to resort to meaningful compromise from start to finish. And I think of like India in particular. So, people will often sort of say, oh, maybe these tactics are successful in the developing world. And it's like, well, there are like a billion Indians who will disagree with you. But it is a more kind of varied picture, I would say.
Great, thank you.
Interesting. Okay. We've got another question from Martin Gallardo. Martin?
Hi, do you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Martin Gallardo. I'm a first year student from SSP. I am also a Peruvian diplomat. I have some questions regarding, I've read your book. Actually, congratulations, I really enjoy it. What's your opinion regarding the Chinese mechanism to appoint ambassadors? Do you believe that the Chinese diplomatic system have some preferences for the world warrior diplomats to some specific places, for example, and what would you consider that their approach to Latin America? Right now, China has taken advantage of during Trump's administration and has penetrated very much into Latin America, so they are very into our region. You can see it with the Sinopharm vaccines and all the COVID issues, right? So what do you think would be your basically the Chinese ambassador's appointment mechanism? Do you think that it gives some preferences to these Cold War diplomats? And how do you think that those diplomats or those World War diplomats could be in Latin America? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I feel like I'm only sort of partially capable of answering it. Like in general, the appointment of ambassadors in the Chinese system is based on seniority and specialty. So Chinese diplomats spend a long time, as you know, going back and forth, often between one country and Beijing or a couple of countries and Beijing for their entire career, whereas their US counterparts or their British counterparts will jump around a lot more and kind of tend towards being generalists rather than specialists. So people who make it to those ambassadorial roles will often have served in those countries 4 or 5 times before they get to, and then back in the regional division in Beijing as well, focusing on that area. So they'll have developed like a great deal of specialism and usually language abilities by the time they get to that stage too. There are exceptions. Gui Tongyo in Sweden, as far as I understand, didn't speak any Swedish, was a former Soviet expert. And interestingly, China's last couple of choices in the United States have kind of broken with that specialist model as well. In the past, Chinese ambassadors to the US tended to have extensive experience in country here, either as America specialists in the foreign ministry, in that kind of group of people that followed Yang Jiechi up the chain from the 70s onwards, or as diplomats at the United Nations in New York, where they also got significant time on the ground in the US. Cui Tiankai is an Asia specialist and broke from that. Qin Gang is a Europe specialist, and I think both of those people were chosen because of kind of unique skill sets that afforded that. And the other notable feature of China's ambassadorial appointments is that there is very little or no space for political appointments, in the sense that like a former congressperson might get appointed to an ambassadorship in the US, or someone who supported a political campaign. There have been a couple of cases where ambassadors have had experiences in the international liaison department. There are a few posts where they'll come up from like MOFCOM instead of the MFA. So, ambassadors to WTO are typically MOFCOM appointments. I don't really know how that feeds through into Latin America, though. I imagine that they'll just continue with.
And Peter, can I ask you on that?
Of course.
Have there been any examples that you can think of sort of wolf warrior diplomacy toward Latin America, right? Sweden, you've talked about Sweden, you've talked about France, obviously Australia. Any in Latin America?
Yeah, Venezuela and Brazil are the two cases that that jump out. I think in the tweeted that people should shut up and wear a mask. And in Brazil, a Chinese diplomat got into a public spat with Bolsonaro's son, also about the virus. But that was kind of at the height of the international backlash against China when diplomats.
And Martin, it sounds like you think there may have been an incident in Peru. Please share with us.
Yeah, actually, the thing was that when Peru was trying to decide which vaccines like to buy, or which one the first one to enter, the Chinese diplomats, they were very I don't want to say aggressive, but they were very fast in making the lobby and advocacy to move their vaccines, and that at the end caused some internal troubles. Maybe if you watch like we can further talk about this issue, but for sure, Chinese diplomats were very strong or were very pushing into making these Sinopharm vaccines, making the first one to buy it, right? And not only Peru, like in the whole region. So they were very.
But then there's the question, is that wolf warrior diplomacy, or is that just good commercial and public diplomacy, right? I think the way Peter talks about wolf warrior diplomacy, it's like sort of aggressive, assertive, right? I mean, Peter, how should we, all of us, think about the distinction between sort of wolf warrior diplomacy and just sort of, very active public diplomacy and or commercial diplomacy? Where does the line lie?
Right. I mean, it's a good question. I think of like, I'm sure he's a mutual friend of yours as well, Jorge, the former Mexican ambassador to China. He lives in Washington, works for McClarty Associates. Has stories that stretch back way before the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy, where Chinese diplomats would deploy tactics which certainly look pretty wolfish now. I don't know if it's possible to. Right. So that's why I tend to think of it as like a tactic whose prominence ebbs and flows over time, rather than like something that's either on or off. I don't know exactly where I would draw the line, but there were you think of someone like Xia Zhukang in the 2000s. China in general,
the 1990s, not even 2000s, even
in China in general wasn't in kind of wolf warrior mode, but Xia, like, for whatever reason, some people kind of attribute it to his experiences in the Cultural Revolution. But
I remember him saying shut up several times when we would we'd criticize China for selling arms, for selling missiles to Pakistan or Iran, and then of course we'd go ahead and sell stuff to Taiwan. And shut up was sort of a common refrain. Martin, did you want to come back in here, and then we're going to go to our last question from Philip Rogers. Martin, did you have anything you want to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, Peter, we definitely have to watch out for wolf warrior diplomacy in Latin America. It sort of feels like the new frontier. So we're going to come back to Philip, and I think this is probably our last question. But of course, if there's anybody else that wants to get one in under the wire, please do. Philip, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me another bite at the apple. So one of the things that I think is very, very strong about the argument that you're making, and very compelling, is that we should look at this as a tactic, not necessarily a overriding ideology or something. It's a part of a performance repertoire. So that got me thinking about two sorts of issues. One, most recently with AUKUS, right? Why do you not necessarily choose that performance repertoire with that situation? And then two, sort of perhaps a very unfair question, but how much of this might be unobservable? How much wolf warrior diplomacy gets pulled out of the bag and we don't ever really hear about it because it was behind closed doors and people just want to forget about it and move forward?
Both good questions. I mean, China was already in pretty much full wolf warrior mode with Australia, and so I don't really see how they could have kind of escalated further with the AUKUS deal. I was pretty upset with the UK and the US as well. Maybe they see some kind of advantage in the fact that the French are so upset about the deal and there's some kind of opening there, but they kind of already had the volume turned up pretty high on all of those countries. So perhaps
and they did buzz Taiwan with fighter jets too. So
that's true. And then remind me your second question.
The second question, so the unobservable
right?
element of this, like how much of this might actually happen, and people just don't make a big deal out of it because it was steam in a meeting, or people don't really want it to get out of control, or whatever the case may be at any diplomatic point X, Y, or Z.
I think most of it happens behind closed doors. Actually, that I would routinely have meetings with foreign diplomats in Beijing who would relay kind of wolf warrior type stories, but we were speaking off the record, and you've got to respect that as a journalist, and so you can't write them up, but then you can go and write a story using things that are out there in public, right, and weaving together the story, but your reporting is informed by the knowledge that while some envoys are saying things publicly and on Twitter, there are a whole bunch of meetings going on which fit the frame of wolf warrior diplomacy. And as I said, Qin Gang, he could be a little bit controversial when he was foreign ministry spokesman, but there's not much evidence of him going on wild tirades in public. But he can really lay into people in private, and does that, then you have kind of the curious question of like, do we count him as a wolf warrior diplomat or not? Because his public persona is a little bit more measured, but in private, he's capable of behaving like that.
再次谢谢你。
Excellent. Well, Peter, that's it for the questions. You've given us a lot of your time and some wonderful